This episode is brought to you in part by Pittsburgh Seminary's Henderson Leadership Conference, September 22nd to 24th, with Dr. Diana Butler Bass. Attend in person or online for lectures and workshops with strategies for ministry amid political and theological divisions. Visit www.pts.edu/Henderson.
This episode is brought to you by Our Daily Bread Ministries, a global media organization that makes the life-changing wisdom of the Bible understandable and accessible to all. Visit whereyou'refrom.org for more information. That's whereyafrom.org.
Hey, Truce Podcast listeners, this is Chris from the Truce Podcast. We've been doing episodes every other week for the last few months, and as a little bonus to say thank you for your patience while I get these complex episodes together, I'm giving you this special interview that I did with Vladimir Prokhnevskiy, who, along with his family, was a Christian refugee from Ukraine. His father was an underground pastor in Ukraine under the Soviet Union. His story is super interesting, but I couldn't fit it into any of the other episodes, so I've decided to include it here just for you. Towards the end, Vladimir is going to talk about a program that he participated in as a kid. It's called Operation Christmas Child. And that program allows churches in countries like the United States to send shoeboxes full of school supplies and soap and toothbrushes and all that kind of stuff to kids in need around the world. And Vladimir received one of those shoeboxes as a kid. So you'll hear about that later on. Thank you for listening to the Truce Podcast, and here's Vladimir. Well, first of all, can you introduce yourself?
Yeah, so my full name is actually Vladimir Prokhnevskiy. When I moved to the United States, we moved to East Tennessee, and they called me Vladimir. That's how I went. So if you're from East Tennessee, I'm Vladimir. If you're from everywhere else, I'm Vladimir. But I moved to the United States as a Christian refugee back in 2000. So I was 12 and a half years old, family of 9 kids. I come from a family of, my dad was a pastor of an underground church back in the day. And by the way, both my parents are still alive today. They live up in Columbus, Ohio, where it's so flat you can watch your dog run away for 3 days, maybe even 4 days. But they're just amazing, godly people. You know, that saying, preach the gospel, and if you have to use words, that's how I would describe my parents. They walked it out. And my father, being a believer living in communist country, he definitely faced some challenges, well, I'm sure we'll get into later in the podcast. But that's pretty much what I am. I moved, so when I was 12 years old, moved to East Tennessee. We had 2 churches sponsor us when we moved to the United States. We moved as refugees, and which was pretty cool because it was 2 different denominations. It was like a Presbyterian and a Methodist church coming together, putting away their differences, which to me was kind of weird because growing up, I kind of witnessed a lot of denominations fighting with each other, but it was really cool to see 2 different denominations putting away their differences and just helping a family in need. And I mean, this is a huge family, right? 9 kids altogether, was 11 of us.
Wow. And
they found a house for us. They covered rent for a whole year. They brought us food. Just like random people would show up every single day with food, with clothes. They'd take us shopping. Some of the people from both churches would take us on the vacations with them. So they would have like an extra seat or something, or an extra room or something like that. And they would take us, and others volunteered to take us to soccer practice and other things. So it was just really cool. When we moved to East Tennessee, we definitely experienced Southern hospitality at its best. And growing up, you know, when we grew up in Kiev, Ukraine, we didn't have much. I always say that we pretty much grew up on rice and potatoes, which I often jokingly say that we were vegetarians before it was even cooler. And I mean, even growing up, we had to share a toothbrush. We had to take turns to go outside to play because we only had so many pairs of shoes. So, I mean, scarcity, as you can imagine.
Yeah.
And so that was kind of like and actually, like, we grew up in a tiny 3-bedroom apartment, and my mom, she didn't have a washer and a dryer. So she had to do all the laundry by hand with this like old Soviet bar of soap. I don't know if you've ever seen it. It's like this brown thing. It's it's like, it looks like a brick. It's brown. It smells terrible. It has this like the soapiness is it's kind of brown. It's just terrible. It's not anything I would want my kids to use. But it's one of those soaps that you can find at a Whole Foods store now for a lot of money.
Yeah.
Which beats me, right? It's organic, so people want it. But back then, I despised that thing, and because my mom did so much laundry with her hands, with that soap, her hands or skin would often crack and bleed, and then she would stay up like all night. She would make socks and underwear for us. So when we moved to the United States, and I thought it was really awesome for the first time when my mom saw a washer and a dryer. When we moved to that house, they provided us with a washer and a dryer. Wow. It was special to see Mom being so excited. And I'm a talker, so I can talk your ears.
Please do. Please do. That's fantastic. What took your parents to Ukraine in the first place?
Well, we all grew up. My dad, I guess the Prokhnevskiy last name, the roots are from Poland, but somehow and my mom, her roots are like from Belarus, I think. At least my dad claimed that for years. But my mom was adopted when she was young. She also comes from a large family, and I guess her mom died at birth. And when she was, I think she was also a twin, and so. Her mom died, and her dad, he already had, I don't know if it was like 11 kids or something like that. He just couldn't handle all the kids. So he gave up both of the twins for adoption. And so one family adopted my mom, and another family adopted her brother. And so she was adopted, growing up in Kiev, Ukraine. All her life, she didn't know she was adopted. And she was an atheist, pretty much. She didn't believe in God. And my dad, he comes from a different background. He comes from a background where his mom was a believer, even though my dad was like an alcoholic for like 20 some years or something like that. But his mom was not just a believer, but she was like a big time believer, And so he comes from roots that like his uncle was a big, how can I say this? He was like a big time leader in the Christian community in Kiev. In fact, he wrote books. And his name is Boyka. I just recently Googled him, and he was just a well-known, he was persecuted. There's a whole book written in the Russian language that I'm looking forward to read, because a lot of my family members or like my grandma's mentioned that book as well. So it's really, apparently it was a big deal back then. I didn't know. He even played for the professional team Dynamo Kiev at one point, from what I hear. So anyway, but he was heavily persecuted by the KGB. In that book, he tells a lot of stories, which I wish I read it before I came on this podcast. And so they come from totally different backgrounds. They get together, and my dad was halfway in, halfway out in the world, halfway in the church kind of thing, and was heavily into alcohol. And then one day he just gets a radical encounter with God and totally walks away from alcohol. And my mom said she will never, ever, ever become a Christian, because Christians weren't really the cool people in the Soviet Union at that time. They were kind of considered like the lunatics, what do they call them? Like these, the society, like secret society kind of thing. Something that you wouldn't want to be a part of, like witches. And there was plenty of propaganda my dad was telling about how on TV they would find like a rare case where someone did something, there was some kind of sacrifice or something. People sometimes do crazy things. Not everyone who calls themselves a Christian is a Christian. And they would take this case and they would make it public, and they would say, hey, look, this is what Christians are. They're pedophiles, or they're this, they're that. The reason why they have such large families is because they're pedophiles and all these different things. So my mom, she didn't want anything to do with Christians. Right. So she said, over my dead body, in fact. And then one time my dad went away I think he went to Poland. He was working there or something like that. And her friend dropped off at her house an alcohol making machine. I think it was like a vodka making machine, which anyway, I don't even know why mom took something like that in, because it was illegal to have something like that. And so I guess her friend was going away somewhere for the weekend, and she said, hey, listen, can I just leave this in your house over the weekend? And she said, fine, sure. And this is what my mom told me just recently, I found out. She said every night around like at 3:00 in the morning or something like that, spirits would come out of that alcohol making machine, and there would be like mermaids and all these different cartoon characters and stuff. And they would like come out of that machine and they would float in the air, and they would get really close to my mom's face and then just like, show their like teeth to her. And so it was like on the clock every single night. I think it was 3:00 in the morning. Don't quote me on that, but Anyway, and so my mom, obviously she didn't believe in the spiritual world. She didn't believe in anything like that until that moment, which is kind of interesting, Chris. Now when I drive by, like, you see like a liquor store where it says a beer, wine, and spirits. It gives me a totally different meaning now after that story. So that alcohol making machine had spirits. And so anyway, 2-3 nights in a row, or something like that, 2 nights or something like that, Mom was facing that, and it got to the point to where she was scared to go back in the house. And so needless to say, after that, she ran to church.
Wow.
So that's my mom's conversion, how she became a
It's
Christian.
amazing. It really does. It takes all kinds of things to reach all kinds of people. And the Lord does use visions sometimes to get people's attention. That's incredible. But so were they actually missionaries in Ukraine?
I mean, not necessarily like a term missionary. They were just followers of Christ, and their goal was to make disciples, and that's what they did. Not necessarily, they weren't paid for any of this. It's interesting in our culture back then, especially, and I think it carries over to this culture as well. Like a lot of our Soviet people when they moved to the United States, a lot of Russian-speaking churches, pastors don't get a salary, which is kind of interesting. It's not really a career for them; it's just a calling. So. My dad, I don't think he ever got paid for any of his work. So it was just something he did outside of work. That was his pastoral duty that he felt like that was what God called him to do. And that's what he did. And it was dangerous. In fact, in one time they threatened to send him to work on the reactor at Chernobyl, which would be a death sentence. I remember he was telling me that story. But it's amazing. When church is persecuted, when the church has to surrender 100% to God, when the church's back is against the wall, so to speak, and they have to surrender, there's no other way. That's when beautiful things happen, when you put all your trust in God. And God really protected the church. God told me stories of how they would because all the local authority, the KGB, they monitored all the phone calls and everything. So it's kind of hard to tell people when to meet, where to meet. And so they would literally have 3 locations. Let's say we have 3 places where we can meet next week. And they would all just say, okay, we have these 3 places. Now let's pray and see what the Holy Spirit tells us which one is safe. And sure enough, they will pray, and somebody get up and say, the Holy Spirit spoke. And then they would pray, have confirmation. And that's how God protected them. They would have I've heard of stories how dreams and visions would, people would have dreams and visions of the time and the place where to meet. And sure enough, they would show up and they would have church, just stuff like that, just crazy stuff.
Wait, so tell me, working at Chernobyl, it was a death sentence before the accident, or this is after the accident?
This was already after the accident. I think my dad one time in passing told me that it's that one time they threatened to send me to work in the reactor because they tried to, everything was owned by the state. We have to keep in mind this was a communist country. There was no private sector. You couldn't just hey, I don't like what you guys are doing. I'm just going to start my own business and I'm going to start my own little neighborhood. You couldn't just do that. So you kind of had to go with the flow. Working. So my dad had a job, and every time he was captured and written up, it greatly affected his pay. They would mess with his vacations. Instead of taking a summer vacation, they would make sure he'd get a winter vacation or miss a bonus or something like that. They would just try to hurt Christians the best way they knew how. So that's kind of thing. So, and at one point they just got so fed up with him because he would he was like a frequent flyer, in the local authority's office. So they just said, hey, they were threatening him to send him to work on the reactor. And it's actually interesting. When that happened, 1986, I believe that's when the Chernobyl accident happened. And it's interesting because I just recently heard of a guy who I was speaking at the church, and there was a guy who was from that church, but I missed him by just a day or so. He was just there, and he was talking about how he was also from my neck of the woods. How they sent him 2 or 3 times to actually work on the reactor at Chernobyl, and with each crew he went, everyone died except for him, and obviously he's still alive today. So, again, the safest place to be is on assignment if God wants you to be there, and that's your safest place. You don't have to worry. You don't have to fear about anything. Even if it does look like you might die, it doesn't matter because God will protect.
And to what degree was the church underground in Ukraine? Or
I just spoke to my father just about an hour ago, and I was going through some of the questions that you asked me, and just asking. I finally got him on the phone, and I was just like, "Hey, Dad, let me ask you a few questions." And that's the one I asked him, and he was just like, "Well, it depends on the time." It says, so it was because of the time. So there were times when there was no freedom at all. The whole church was underground. So there was a time, but then it was 50-50. Freedom was given, but with a compromise. So, for example, like kids under a certain age were not allowed to be in church. People that came from other villages or cities, they were not allowed to preach or share the God. Preach. Obviously, preaching on the streets was not allowed at all. And so, if you think about it, that was during the time when my dad was. He said it was like after the 70s. He says before the war, it was like nobody was pretty much allowed. Make sure I get this right. But then, like after the 70s, he says 79 was a freer. That was the time when he was there, and they were still controlling and listening to stuff, and they still had their foot in the door, so to speak. If a pastor is saying something they don't like, they would remove that pastor from authority from registered churches. So, if you think about it, if the kids are not allowed, if there are all these different limitations, things that they had to abide, and like sermons had to be viewed ahead of time or reviewed and all this stuff. That's why my father decided, look, this is not a church. If you strip all those things, it becomes like Boy Scouts of America. People just show up.
Yeah.
I'll just do that a little. Yeah, it's a club, right? It's a club, and so people show up, and then it's powerless, right? And so my father decided that this is not what he wanted to do, and so they decided to go underground. And there was obviously a price to pay. They couldn't just, or they had to like meet at different apartments, different places, and they would show up in like 5-minute increments just so they wouldn't draw attention on themselves. And like in the middle of the nights and different parts of the city. And, if you think about it, there's like 40, 50 or 60 people showing up all at once. It had to be coordinated. Just showing up to church had to be very strategic. Now thinking about it, my gosh. And then when they show up, those apartments are Soviet apartments are so small. And even that, some neighbor can really catch on to things and then tip the local authority and they'll be there within minutes. And that happened before too. And a lot of times things like that happen when they disobeyed. Let's say they just decided to go with their own flow instead of praying and asking God for wisdom. And so God was teaching the church. He was leading the church. He was protecting the church. And even though the times were hard, I feel like in a weird way, and this is my personal opinion, just observing my father. When he moved to the United States, he was so active in the Ukraine. But when he moved to the United States, he doesn't speak the language until even now. Both my parents don't really speak English. But because he doesn't speak English, his world got much smaller. And moving to the United States, he couldn't really do much here except for being a part of like a Russian church somewhere. And it was kind of sad in a way because my father was so involved in the church. And it's persecution, even though it sounds so terrible. It sounds like it's such a bad time. But it was like war for them. Yeah. They were excited. They saw miracles. And, when persecution comes, it's not necessarily bad because it's kind of like, when there's darkness, light shines much brighter. And that's kind of how it was in persecution.
This episode is brought to you by No Small Endeavor, the acclaimed podcast from Great Feeling Studios and PRX. In each episode, host and award-winning theologian Lee C. Camp sits down with courageous and impassioned people, like Hollywood legend Rob Reiner and civil rights hero Reverend James Lawson, talking about what it means to find true happiness and flourish in day-to-day life. And if you're looking for somewhere to start, why not check out the recent episode with award-winning journalist and best-selling author Tim Alberta on Christian nationalism's role in the Republican Party. Follow No Small Endeavor on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. Well, and why did you guys have to leave Ukraine?
Good question. Well, we had an opportunity to leave earlier. We moved in 2000, which obviously in 2000 was there was not much persecution at all. In fact, that's my father was saying how there were times where nobody was able to. There were no churches at all. Everything was underground. Then it was 50-50, and then after the fall, it was pretty much anybody can do anything. And he says it was awesome because they would like straight up have revivals on the street. They would preach, and it was so new for Soviet Union, so people were so hungry for the Word of God, and so we didn't because sometimes people ask me like, well, Vladimir, why did you guys move as refugees? Because we moved as persecuted Christians, refugees in 2000 when there was freedom. But because we were persecuted before 90, see, technically I'm older than my country. I was born in 1987, USSR, and my country became a country in 1991. So which is kind of like a weird case, right?
Yeah.
And so because we were hindered from advancing in society, I mean, we were pretty much handicapped in the society already. And then after the fall, things got even harder for a lot of big families, Christian families. And so there was I think under Reagan, he had this, he opened like a door for persecuted Christians that were persecuted during the Soviet Union to leave and come to the United States. And we were able to use that to come here. And because, people don't change overnight. Just because Soviet Union fell apart doesn't mean that people's hearts changed, right? In fact, it got worse for Christians. So that's why we moved. And that was the main reason for better life, because before we moved, things got much worse for us. We didn't have much money to work with. That was a time when we had to share toothbrushes, take turns to go outside to play because we had only so many pairs of shoes. I remember my pants were getting smaller and smaller on me. Just before we moved, it got worse and worse. And so it was really, it was a miracle coming here. I don't think I'd be alive today if I didn't move to the United States. It's just the truth.
Oh, why is that? Why wouldn't you be alive?
Well, because I think this is just obviously my personal opinion. I think because times were so hard. I don't know. I don't know what I would have done. I sure hope I wouldn't fall for any kind of, I don't know, crimes or anything like that. But there was a lot of instability, and desperate people do desperate things. And I was very young. When I moved to the United States, I became a Christian after I already moved, meaning I started following Christ. I was 12 years old when I moved to the United States. And even though I grew up in the Christian family, you still got to walk it out, right? When you become older, when you're an adult. And so I'm just so happy that I moved, because I had good mentors when I moved. And so I think it all worked out. But if we stayed because of the Russian war and everything, a lot of times larger families had to give their kids to the war quicker. I think that because we were from a family of 9, definitely some of us would see the war, that was happening just recently with the whole Russia in the Donetsk area. So I think if it wasn't the war, I would probably, I don't know. I'm afraid that back then I wasn't following Christ like I am now. Yeah. I'm afraid that I might have been a part of something like a mob or something like that. But this is just the first. Obviously, God protected me from all that. But you never know what would have been.
Well, can you tell me a little bit about your Operation Christmas Child experience? Because I saw the video. Yeah.
So when I was in Ukraine, I received a shoebox when I was 9 years old, and man, again, growing up, we didn't have access to a lot of toys. In fact, we made yo-yos out of Coca-Cola caps, which kind of cool. We'd go outside, we'd find Coca-Cola caps, we'd drill a little hole through the middle, put a little match, some strings, and in fact, those old school Coca-Cola bottles, if you take the cap off and it has this little plastic ring that seals the cap, if you take that off and invert it, it had little plastic teeth on it. So we would slide those on the ends of the caps, and our yo-yo had like spikes, and it would cut through paper and grass. I mean, it was pretty sweet, right? That's what we did. We played with our shoes, pretending they were cars, and so that's so growing up, we didn't have a lot of things, and one day we were invited to come to a Christmas celebration, which was cool. What I like about Samaritan Express Operation Christmas Child is that how intentional it is. It's not just, I'm going to give you a gift and it's going to be awesome, but you're going to get a gift, and at the same time, they will give you the gospel. 12 weeks discipleship courses lessons come with these boxes. So kids get to hear about the gospel of Jesus Christ. And not only that, but they're also encouraged to share the gospel of Jesus Christ. So each box, they say on average, reaches about like 6 to 9 kids or something like that. So, it's a tool to reach to lost. And that's why I love it, because kids are the next generation. And man, there's so many different testimonies how thousands of churches were started because of these shoe boxes. Pastors would literally use them like tools to get kids and to get people in the church, and then they would hear the gospel. And so they get a physical gift, the box, and then a spiritual gift, right? And so that's why I'm so on fire and excited about Operation Christmas Child, because how intentional it is, Yeah.
Well, do you remember anything from your box?
Yeah. So I get a yo-yo. So I didn't have to make yo-yos out of Coca-Cola caps.
Yes.
I had my own toothbrush, so I didn't have to share one with anybody anymore, which is pretty exciting. I had these Hot Wheel cars, which was really cool. And, I didn't have to play with my shoes anymore, pretending they were cars. I got, and this is kind of funny, I got a dental floss, which I thought was candy. And I remember licking it. I remember thinking, you Americans have some crazy candy. Like, what is this? What is this? I thought maybe it was some kind of diet candy or something like that. And in fact, it wasn't until like many years later when we moved to the United States and we were at our first dentist appointment, and that's where I learned what dental floss is really for. So,
Wow.
Yeah, and I had this bar of soap, which was really cool. It was like the whitest white I've ever seen. Remember how I told you about the Russian soap, the Soviet soap? Well, This one was like the opposite. It was like the whitest white, smelled so good, had these like smooth edges, so slick. The way it was the way it was designed had this nice curve to it, and it had the print of the dove. I always jokingly say that it was like the Holy Spirit in the box, right? It sanctified my whole box. And so that was, but also I got school supplies. And, growing up, unfortunately, I had to lie to my teachers that I forgot my school supplies because I was too embarrassed to admit that I couldn't afford them. And my teacher, man, she ridiculed me in front of the whole class. She would make us get up, and it was a humbling experience. And so now I got school supplies with this box as well, and it's just a bunch of cool things. It was really awesome. All the years I forgot a lot of detail, but I never forgot how it made me feel. And when you pack these shoe boxes, people pack them with so much love, and on the receiving end, children feel that same love. And I always say this, that God is love, and when you show love to people, you show God to people. And when people experience love, they experience God. And once you experience that God's unconditional love, you will not walk away unchanged.
Special thanks to Vladimir Prokhnevskiy for sharing his story. He and his twin brother run ukramedia.com. I'll put links to that in the show notes. It's a super helpful website that teaches people to make motion graphics. God willing, we'll be back next week with a full episode. Just a reminder that the Truce Podcast is listener-supported. Please consider donating a little each month through our website at trucepodcast.com. We're also on Instagram, Twitter, and Facebook, and we'd love for you to follow us there. Finally, as my challenge this week, I want to encourage you to join our email update list. It's free and has links to our guests and notes from the show. Thanks for listening. I'm Chris Staron, and this is Truce.